to be out again here Sunday night. Some may be asking, what is he wearing? Lovely day today. It was a lovely sunny day. I'm trying to keep the summer feel continuing going. It's nice to be here in the evening, daylight saving, and the light's still up. It's nice to be out. Think of a phrase, harden up princess. Some may have heard of it more than others. Some may have said it more than others. But being tough, something about the New Zealand culture from man's side. Being strong, not showing any emotions, don't show a tear. Don't show any emotions. Be tough. Grit your teeth and, like the British background, be stoic. Harden up. Get through it. Be a man. Tonight's lesson, I'm looking at tears in the Bible. Tears in the Bible. We have several cases. We have many cases. Peter's remorse. As spoken, I'm sure we've heard many lessons on the prophecy of Peter's betrayal of Jesus, denial of Jesus. And when that third crow of the rooster, and it says that Jesus looked at him directly, you can just imagine Peter seeing Jesus' eyes looking at him. His heart sank, realizing what he had done. The shock of what Jesus had said had come true. And the emotion grabbed him, and it says that Peter went out and he wept bitterly because of it. Wept bitterly because of it. No doubt, Judas at that time, after the betrayal of Jesus, was filled with remorse. It says that he was filled with remorse. Matthew 27:3 says, seeing that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the priests and to the elders. No doubt there was tears shed from Judas. In Acts, we have Paul on his way to Jerusalem, the account of the brethren saying farewell to him. In Acts 20, verse 36, there's a sorrowful farewell, a bidding farewell. They loved Paul so much that they didn't want to let him go. In chapter 21, verse 1, it says, after we had torn ourselves away from them. So that's how close the bond was between them. The relationship was that strong. That's described as tearing yourselves away from. They didn't want to be apart from each other. But there was jobs to do, and Paul had to go to different areas. There was great remorse and tears of sorrow of their departure. An expression of Paul's in verse 31 of chapter 20. He writes, I never stop warning each of you or praying for each of you day and night with tears. There was that much concern for the welfare of his brethren that he had them on his heart. And whether it's just the expression, but no doubt it was that moving to think about his brethren, that he was moved day and night with tears, concerning about them and their welfare, whether they're doing all right, whether they're managing themselves in the right way. Godly men, when Stephen was stoned, Stephen, a godly and holy man, was stoned to death, but those brothers gathered his body and mourned for him deeply in Acts 8, verse 2. And they're just a few examples, and I'm sure there's many more examples to look at. And I'm sure even from our own experiences, we can recall times when we've shed a tear, times when our eyes have welled up at a thought of something, a death of a loved one, whether it's sorrow or whether it's joy, the birth, a wedding, a farewell of friends. Each of us have had, at some times, shedding a tear. And each of us are different. Each of us are, we have different levels. Some of us, some may shed a tear more easily than others. But there's something in our design that we are made to cry. Our eyes have that function of tears that form and will be shed. Some find it physically hard to share, but I know, as I've said, some are easy to cry. But each of us are made differently. Each of us have that emotional level, and we know that things that are going to make us going to cross that, bring a tear to our eyes. First example I want to look at tonight is tears from Jesus. So we've looked at different examples from the Bible, but what about Jesus? In Isaiah, it refers to Jesus, a man of sorrows. There are examples to choose from where he was sorrowful and sad. Yet I only found two examples where it says that he cried, excluding the crucifixion. In Luke 19, verse 41, as he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city. He saw the city and he wept over it. Imagine from a distance Jesus coming to Jerusalem for the last time. And in the distance, the great city of his people, the capital of his people, the holy city. He was going to be entering as a king. And then only in a few days, he was going to be abandoned. He was going to be left alone. He was going to be turned against, and he was going to be executed. He knew what lay ahead. All those that had followed him would abandon him in his time of need. The thought had been on his mind, must have been on his mind. He knew what lay ahead. And when he saw that city, he was overwhelmed with emotion and wept for it. Makes me think, those that were with him, wonder if they thought, what was going on why was Jesus so emotional about this? Why was Jesus crying? In the passage we'll get to in a minute, John chapter 11, verse 35, the shortest verse out of the Bible, it simply says, Jesus wept. There's also examples of Jesus when he was moved or troubled, or his heart or spirit was moved and troubled. Matthew 9:36, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. Matthew 14:14 says, when he landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them. They had traveled far to follow Jesus, to hear what he had to say. And he had compassion on them. Mark 14:33, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. And this is at Gethsemane, when he was only hours away from him being taken away and to be sentenced to death. When we look at Jesus, we can easily say that he was a compassionate person. He was conscious of other people's concerns, even strangers, even people that he didn't know. Christ in his glory in heaven lowered himself to become the likeness of man. He took all the pains, he took all the temptations that we go through, and he took all the sufferings that we go through. He went through all this so that he could show by his example that he was not someone that was removed. He was not someone from just somewhere else and just walking the earth among us. He was among us. He was like us. He did have emotions. He was compassionate. He did weep. He did feel pain. He was an example among us, that going through all these things, that he could still be that example that we can look to. And he remained perfect and blameless and without sin through all those emotions. If you read Philippians 2, 1 to 11, the nature of God, him becoming the nature of man, from heaven coming to earth, having to go through all those things. We know that passage. The passage I'll be looking at is Lazarus in John chapter 11. John chapter 11 begins from verse 17. Jesus had heard that Lazarus was sick, and he intentionally delayed the time in getting to Bethany. He waited 4 days before he would meet Mary and Martha, making sure 4 days for Lazarus to be dead in the tomb. Well and truly the process of death was taking place. And there's some interesting points out of the passage that I'd like to look at and go through tonight. If you read in chapter 11, from verse 30 onward. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforted her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Verse 35, Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who had opened the eyes of the blind man had kept this man from dying?" Some interesting points and thoughts off this passage. Jesus arriving, he saw those weeping and were moved. He was moved in spirit and troubled. And he showed the sympathy to his friends, Mary and Martha, by sharing in them the sorrow. And it appeared in 3 ways. One, it moved him in spirit, or as some translations say, groaned in spirit. From the very depths of his being, he was just not concerned about their welfare, but he was deeply concerned. He was deeply moved. He was inwardly and sincerely affected by the situation. An example here for us as Christ to have our own love and sympathy without any question. To be genuine in our expression of love to one another. To be true to self and to be honest. If there's an emotional time and someone's upset and someone's crying, sometimes to comfort them, share with them in that grief. Simple verse that we have out of the Bible is 1 Corinthians 12:26. When one member suffers, all suffer together. If one is honored, we rejoice together. Jesus was connected with all and connected to his friends then. Said he was troubled. I think this is significant. He had all the passions and the emotions and affections of human nature, for he was like mankind. He had taken on the form of man. Jesus had a command of them which he was never out of control. His emotions were he never expressed emotions out of control. And we know the example of him in his anger clearing the temple. It was a controlled. He showed a controlled action when clearing the temple. He didn't lose control in his anger. Doesn't lose emotion when it comes to grief. But he knows when to show it. He He acts accordingly. Here in the situation, Jesus is troubled for his friends, becoming like them and showing his concern for them. In verse 34, he asks, "Where have you laid him?" This is Jesus. Jesus knows the hearts of people. Jesus could have known easily where they put Lazarus. But he was asking, I think, to express himself as a man. Where is he? Where is he? And also to make sure that it wasn't a scam, to be accused later on to say he just walked straight to the tomb. He knew exactly where Lazarus, he hadn't been here before and went straight to the tomb. It was a setup. He's asked for the tomb, and they would lead him to the tomb. "Come see, Lord," is what they said. Come see the tomb, the grave, and that getting to the tomb would affect him even more. By his tears, Christ gave proof of his humanity. He didn't only just take on the flesh and blood of man, but he also took on the nature of man. We weep, we cry, we do get emotional, susceptible to impressions of joy, grief, and sorrow. He showed he was a man. He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, as mentioned in Isaiah. He was not afraid of sharing that grief among others, to express that grief. And such is our friend and Lord Jesus. Thankfully, he is there for us to sympathize and care for us as well in our struggles and our grief. It is worthy of noting that the Jewish period of mourning was 7 days, and Jesus arriving on the 4th, they were very much in the middle of their mourning process, the Jewish mourning process. So arriving at the tomb, there's no doubt tears and maybe wailing even. Following into verse 36 and 37, as I read, the Jews said, "See how much he loved him. See how much he loved him." Some of the Jews may have been looking at this moment, seeing Jesus and going, see how emotional he is. See how much he did love Lazarus. But as they said later on, if he could heal a blind man, but he wasn't here to save Lazarus. And it's a similar saying as we know, on the cross. People were saying you could save others, but you could not save yourself. There's that negative twist on looking at Jesus and going through that emotion. What's the point of this passage? What could have Jesus done in this situation? Jesus could have turned up at the funeral and says, "What is this? Stop. Lazarus is gone. Get on with life." But that's not what he did. Arriving late, he could have not shed any tear. He could have come in and asked, "When's dinner ready?" But that's not the example that Christ showed. He came in, he could have just come in and shared in the grief of his friends, but actually it was the third time that he showed the power of giving the life to the dead, giving proof that he was from God. Here was an opportunity, Jesus coming, and that goes back to the delay and Lazarus having so many days in the tomb, giving the power, showing the power of God and his authority, that he was from God. This drew the faith of many of the Jews that witnessed that, but there were also those who spurned the hatred even more. And we know that the hatred of the chief priests and the Pharisees, they planned even more for the plan of Jesus' death. And it says from this time on, Jesus no longer moved about publicly. This leads on to another passage I'd like to look at. Not about Jesus, but another person showing remorse and tears. To Luke 7. Probably the greatest examples and beautiful examples of someone in repentance, of humility before Jesus. Luke chapter 7, from verse 36. Now one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, and so he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When the woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume. She stood behind him at his feet, weeping. She began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume over them. When the Pharisees who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who was touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher. He said, 2 men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he cancelled the debt of both. Now which one of them loved him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Now he turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head. She has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she has loved much. But he who has been forgiven loves little. And Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. And the other guests began to say among themselves, Who is this who even forgives sins? Jesus said to this woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. The Pharisees, they were thinking, stop. Thinking this woman shouldn't be touching you. Don't you know who this woman is? Don't you know the law? Isn't this guy a teacher of the law? And he's got this woman touching him. Those sort of sinners. But Jesus uses this woman as an example here, as a lesson for them of the sincere remorse, the tears that were shed by her humility, her humbleness. And she had been forgiven by Jesus of her sins. And we need to find that way in viewing others. He could have turned to her knowing that what kind of person she was, knowing well her misdeeds in her life. The Lord did not permit that kind of interaction between a religious leader and someone of her status. He could have said, stop, this is not appropriate, step away, but he didn't. And he used this time as a lesson. He used this time for a lesson for Peter, a comparison of what little from the heart Simon had done for him, done for Jesus in comparison. Jesus wants us to be heartfelt believers, sincere from our very beings, from our heart. He wants children to want to be in his family, not out of duty or obligation, but out of their own choice and out of a need to be right before God. Our hearts need to be right. Paul's quote, often referred to when he writes his letters, he often says, love more and more. Love one another, But Paul writes, love one another and build on that love. Strengthen that love. Build that love. How can we love more? How can we develop our heart? You know, the Heart Foundation, New Zealand Heart Foundation calls for us to eat well and to get good exercise. So when we go to the supermarket and we pick up that box of cereal and we look at the health chart and we see how many stars are on that dial, we have a choice to make. Maybe it's 5 stars. Maybe it's good for you. Maybe it's only half a star. Have a choice. So it is with our spiritual stars. We have a choice. What are we filling our bodies with? How are we spiritually? Our heart needs the right environment, needs the right diet. It needs the right exercise. It needs the right practice. Without putting love into action, our heart obviously can become hardened and weakened. Sorrow, joy, remorse, guilt, and all such attributes are from the heart. If our heart is calloused, if our heart is bound by rules, if our heart is bound by guilt, or calloused by hate, by greed, jealousy, other things, it has the inability to function. A heart that's not pumping doesn't bring life. When our heart stops, we're dead. So spiritually, our heart needs to be pumping. You know, it's kind of shocking what has become the norm in society. You think of things that are accepted today that weren't accepted in yesteryear. You know, consciences become numb and accept things nowadays. Things that would shock the heart don't shock us anymore. Christians, unfortunately, we're humans and we too can become numb. We can come to church, we can sit on the pews, we can listen to the lessons and do all the right things that look right. But if our heart's not right before God, you know, and it's being restricted, we are dead. There was an unfortunate case of a young woman that was learning to dive and going out doing diving exercises, and she was wanting a career in the marine biology field, so she was trying to learn to dive. She bought a second-hand dry suit, which is not a wetsuit, but a dry suit which actually has a separate layer, which is regulated with the depths that they go to, because the pressures, the suit has to adjust itself. But these dry suits, you actually need to be qualified. There's actually special training to manage these. There's regulators on the suit. It can pump a temperature around the suit, so it's nice and can be nice and warm and cold, the freezing temperatures. There's a sad case of this girl buying a second-hand one, and she was recommended from a dive shop just to buy one, and she turned up at the training and she had this dry suit, and she went diving to a certain level, but unfortunately the regulation on the suit wasn't working properly. And what happened was the suit just constricted as she went deeper, so that she could no longer breathe, and she died. She sunk to the bottom. She died. They tried to reach her, but as she was sinking, but even the suit had supposed to have tear off weights that they could take, but it just wasn't. It was a real sad case. But you know, that's the restriction on the heart. If it's calloused, if it's being burdened and weakened by things, we too can sink. We need to be alive. We need to be spiritually alive. Conclusion, going back to the passage on Lazarus, verse 35, where Jesus wept, is a short verse, but it gives us an insight into Jesus' heart. Christ gave proof of his humanity in both senses of the word, that as a man he could weep, and as a merciful man he would weep. He chose to weep, comfort, and share in the suffering of others. We don't have any accounts of him laughing, but I have no doubt that he would have enjoyed times and jokes with the fellow disciples, and would have enjoyed times with his disciples. But as you know, there's a few accounts. We have many accounts of him showing compassion and tears and grief. Thus, he shows not only the mournful state will consist with the love of God, but also those who sow and live by the Spirit must also sow in tears. I'd just like to read 1 Corinthians in closing. 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 1-3. And now I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. Without love, I am a resounding gong. Christ showed his example, a tenderness of heart, sincerity of heart, and at the right time he could show and shed a tear with others. In animation, I was told that in America, when Disney was at their peak, the students learning from the masters, they would try and emulate any little detail from the master. So much so that they would try and learn how to hold the pencil as the master would. They would try and emulate the smallest detail of their teacher. So with Christ, with the smallest details, even with the example of a tear, let us be more Christ-like in our lives.